I'd next like to introduce Professor Osuji from the grad school. So after achieving Olympic athlete status, he now studies the physics and physical chemistry of soft materials, especially the implications in energy generation and the design of next-generation microfluidic bioassays, the design of processing complex fluids such as toner inks and cosmetics. Please welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Etienne, and to you and your team for the organization of this wonderful event, and to the students who nominated me to be here. It's a great pleasure and an honor. I would like to share with you tonight stories about some of the research that I do in my lab, but also I think a few stories about the students who actually do the research and what my view is on scientific mentorship. So the topic, broadly speaking, is exploring and harnessing self-assembly in soft materials, which are literally materials which are soft or have low energy densities, and these are the sorts of systems that we study in my lab. But the work that's done would not be possible without the consummate efforts of students and postdocs, several of whom are pictured here, who have worked in my lab over the years. It's a real pleasure to go to the lab every day and see their faces and see their data and engage in long, wonderful discussions and sometimes even arguments with them about their science. And it's really my privilege to work with students and people of that caliber. So just by way of background, many of the materials that we work with in my lab, as I mentioned before, are called soft materials or soft matter. And broadly speaking, this encompasses materials such as polymers and colloidal particles. So polymers, certainly many of us are familiar with. The common manifestation of a polymer is, for example, in a plastic. So we have plastic cups and plastic bottles and saran wrap and things of this nature. And all of us come into contact with polymers on a daily basis, right? And whether you know it or not, you consume soft matter on a daily basis. You consume synthetic polymers, you consume colloidal particles, which are present, for example, in toothpaste. There are synthetic polymers that are used as surfactants or rheology modifiers, materials to affect the flow behavior of fluids and foods that we eat, that we consume on a daily basis. And of course, polymers are incredibly important from an industrial perspective as well. Something like 300 million tons of commodity scale polymers are produced and sold annually at a cost of something like $500 billion, about $400 billion. Okay, so they're incredibly important materials and they're all around us. At the same time, they have very interesting physical behavior that is very rich and complex, even if they are ubiquitous in our world. So the topic that I'll discuss today is self-assembly of block copolymers and soft materials. And what I'm showing here is a cartoon depicting the molecular structure of a block copolymer. A block copolymer is nothing other than the construct that you get when you take one polymer chain, a macromolecule, and attach it, for example, at its end to another polymer chain. So the simplest case of that is what's called an A-B diblock copolymer. So there's a block or a run of one type of material connected to a block or a run of another type of material. Okay? And the presence of these chemically dissimilar units leads to what we call self-assembly or microphase separation in the system. A simple way to think about it is to think about oil and water and the fact that they don't mix, at least at room temperature. If you take two polymer chains which are chemically dissimilar, they try to avoid each other, but because they're physically attached to one another, they can only avoid each other on length scales that are similar to the size of the polymer chain itself. And so you have a very interesting phenomenon in which the system is these two chains are trying to avoid each other to decrease the energetic cost of having contacts with one another. But as they do so, their entropy also goes down. And many of us are familiar with the concept of entropy. The universe tends to maximum entropy, and so the chains want to stretch to avoid contact, but if they stretch too much, then they lose entropy. And so there's a restoring force, there's a happy minimum in which you establish structures that look like this, as a function of the composition of the block copolymer. So you get these very exquisite structures, which are periodic nanostructures, which have length scales on the order of about 5 to maybe 100 nanometers. And these are some examples of those structures. This is an example of hexagonally packed cylinders of one polymer sitting in a matrix of another polymer. And these dimensions here, this is 50 nanometers, so these are domains or objects which are on the order of, say, 10 nanometers in size. And the example shown on the lower right-hand side, this is a scanning electron micrograph of a very exotic, some might say, structure called the double gyroid morphology, in which you have these bicontinuous interconnected networks of one polymer sitting in a matrix of the other polymer. So highly exotic structures which hopefully are good for something. It's they are, trust me. So there's an interesting parallel actually in the natural world, and this is some data from a collaboration that I was fortunate to be a part of with Rick Prum from evolutionary biology, in which structural color exists in certain insects and animals. In other words, we think about color oftentimes as being due to the presence of dyes or pigments in materials, so molecular species which absorb light. And so what we see coming out of that object or a system that has that dye is the light which is not absorbed. You can also have very brilliant colors formed in systems due to the presence of small-scale nanostructures which interfere light that passes through them. Okay? And so this shows up as well in certain butterflies, as well as in certain beetles. And many of these structures are reminiscent of the same structures that are formed by self-assembly in block copolymers. So they actually have uses, one of which would be, for example, in generating structural color in self-assembled materials. So what do we care about? In my group, we focus on block copolymers because they are potentially useful materials. We study their self-assembly and how to control their self-assembly. The reason we want to do that, of course, is that if you're a chemist, and we're not chemists, but if you're a good chemist, you can dial in all sorts of interesting functionality in these polymers by changing the chemical composition of the chains. And if you change the length of the chain, then you change the dimension of that periodic self-assembled structure. So for example, you can make optical materials like the ones that I just referred to if you have the proper index of refraction, contrast, so difference in the optical thickness, if you will. And if the length scale or the periodicity of this structure is sufficient, then you can reflect light of certain colors. Okay? Likewise, you can take systems that self-assemble to form these rods in a matrix, and if you remove the material that forms the rod, then you have the basis, for example, for making a very high-performance filtration membrane. And that's one of the areas that my lab focuses on, the guidance of self-assembly of block copolymers to make nanostructured features which are very monodispersed in their size and which can provide the basis for the fabrication of filtration membranes. Okay? And we're particularly interested in generating filtration membranes for two reasons, water and energy. One is that, of course, membranes are vitally important for purifying water. For example, nanofiltration membranes, reverse osmosis membranes. We in particular work on nanofiltration membranes. And of course, water is indelibly linked to issues of energy, right? So energy utilization, for example, many people would be shocked to learn that something like 5% of all energy utilized in the United States is used for distillation, a separation process, right? So just distilling crude oil to produce gasoline and other petroleum products uses 5% of energy consumed in the United States. And there's a strong drive to go from processes like distillation to processes like membrane separations to reduce the energy intensity of those separations. So there's a strong reason for making next generation filtration membranes, and we think we can do that, for example, with block copolymers and address important issues in water purification and thereby potentially also address issues in energy utilization. That's all very interesting. Maybe a little bit boring, but this is a more interesting cartoon because when I was in grad school, I got very, as an undergrad as well, and in grad school I got very much interested in block copolymers, and I had two advisors who were really wonderful people, and I thought block copolymers were going to rule the world, right? All those applications that I showed on the previous slide, you know, I thought block copolymers should be in outer space, they should be on our glasses, they should be in our hard drives. But the reality is that the most prevalent usage of block copolymers today is in fairly low-tech products like sneakers, right? So the soles of running shoes use block copolymers in large quantities because of the mechanical properties of these self-assembled states. And that's fantastic, makes a lot of money, but it didn't quite satisfy me. So my advisors at the time, two wonderful people, Ed Kramer at Cornell, who unfortunately passed away about 2 years ago, and Ned Thomas at MIT, were very inspirational teachers, and I was fortunate to work in their labs. And they said to me, block copolymers are great, but you need to control their assembly to harness more of their potential. And then they said something to me which I think has stuck in my brain and has made me semi-obsessive about controlling order in block copolymers. Can you make those nanostructures stand up in thin films over large areas? Can you direct the orientation of those self-assembled structures and do so over meaningfully large areas? Because if you can do that, then you can address some of the applications that I mentioned before, one of which, of course, is high-performance membranes. Okay? And so we did. And so in my lab now, we have materials which form the structures that we care about. So these, for example, are very, very small nanopores in a thin film that looks like that, and they're all oriented in the correct direction, and they extend throughout the thickness of the film, and that's really wonderful. And here's another example of that. There's a bunch of data on this slide, but what we've been working on recently, sort of with the whole goal of sustainability in mind, is making membranes that function on the basis of the presence of nanoporous structures from sustainably derived feedstocks. So we take something like linseed oil or soybean oil, and we can generate these fatty acids. So these are things that you could eat, literally. And we self-assemble them to form polymers, which are nanostructured. We control the orientation of those nanostructures, and we end up with materials which, if I had time, I would walk you through it, essentially are highly selective in their adsorption of molecular species. Okay, so our focus, for example, is in using these in nanofiltration applications where you want to remove things like dyes, pesticides, pharmaceutical products and metabolites of pharmaceutical products, et cetera, et cetera. All of that, I think, is somewhat peripheral to the larger story, and I'd like to close on this because I'm essentially out of time, which is science, certainly in my lab and in many other labs, really relies on the contributions of students and postdocs who are, in my lab and I think in general, quite wonderful people. And I think the job of an advisor is to mentor and teach and help those people to come along as best they can. I personally benefited from mentorship from Ned and from Ed that I think I can never repay. And I hope my students enjoy their time in the lab, because there's no time like when you're in the lab, right? I oftentimes diffuse down to the lab and come around and pick at what people are doing and ask them all sorts of questions. And I tell them it's boring in my office. It really is boring in my office. The interesting stuff all happens in the lab. And so your time, I think, as a graduate student is particularly precious. And I am truly fortunate, I would say, to work with students in my group over the years who are wonderful people and who have done wonderful science. And I would like to inspire you to find the joy in doing science day in, day out. Thank you.